The friends of God were not satisfied with preaching the gospel. They rejected and condemned the Roman Catholic dogmas which did not agree with the Bible. As Protestants sometime later, they denied purgatory, indulgences, worship of saints and relics. They didn't confess their sins to the priest. For them, holy or blessed water and the sign of the cross meant nothing. They didn't believe in the sacrifice of the Mass or the real presence of Christ in the host. The Christian slanders as Cathars also declared that the Roman churches were robbers' dens, churches of loops, two-faced frauds, which agree with how even Catholic historians portray them today. To the Albigenses, the Catholic priests were betrayers, liars, and hypocrites. St. Peter never came to Rome and didn't institute the papacy. Therefore, they denied that the Catholic Church was the Church of Christ. Neither were the popes successors of the apostles. They were successors of the emperors. Is it any wonder they held these views? Pope Gregory VII, decades earlier, had pronounced papal supremacy over any other power in the world, be it kings, cardinals, or princes. History confirms the testimony of the Friends of God. 3 years after the Albigenses met to unify their efforts and beliefs, Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was murdered because he challenged the orders of King Henry II of England to subject the priests to judgment by the secular courts. Despite the opulent wealth of that archbishop, the Pope proclaimed him saint in 173. When Henry VIII approved the exhuming of the archbishop's grave in the 16th century, 5,000 ounces of gold were found. The wealth of the papacy was accompanied by the impressive pomp of archbishops and bishops everywhere. Innocent III amplified the papal ambition by pretending to rule over not only the universal church, but also the whole world. According to his own words, when he assumed the papal tiara, he became higher than man, but lower than God. In a sermon, he also stated arrogantly, "We are the successor of the Prince of the Apostles, but not his vicar, not vicar of any man or apostle, but vicar of Jesus Christ himself." The procession which accompanied him at his coronation continued in the tradition of those who gave the popes a standing ovation at their coronations, as they passed through the most significant historical places of Imperial Rome. Should we be amazed that the Cathars categorically denied the pretensions of the popes? Here were those claiming to be the successors of Peter and the vicar of Christ, launching the most infernal machinery of destruction known to that time in order to torture, dismember, mutilate, and burn them at the stake, fabricating any infamous excuse to justify their crimes. Or should we wonder, in this context of Roman depravation, that the Friends of God identified Rome with the bloody apocalyptic harlot? After being slandered for years as committing infanticide and kissing the rectum and genitals of cats, Arnold Hoth stood in front of Catholic theologians in 1207 and referred to the Roman Catholic Church as the mother of fornications and abominations of the land. The Roman Catholic Church is the church of the devil, and her doctrines are doctrines of demons. She is the Babylonia portrayed by the Apostle Jonas, drunk with the blood of the saints and martyrs of Jesus. Christ and the apostles never said the Mass. For them, the Pope was the Antichrist foretold in the Bible. The Albigenses also boldly denounced the violence and lack of Christianity of the inquisitors and papal prelates. Their writings, discovered in the 20th century, declare that Jesus Christ, the faithful Son of our Creator, did not teach those who follow his law to exterminate their enemies in this temporal world. On the contrary, he taught to do good, to forgive those who persecute them and slander them, to pray for them, to do them good, and never resist them through violence. Because such a belief is rooted in the Gospels, they were easy prey for the papal crusades against them. Modern pacifists feel a kindred spirit with these so wrongly called Cathars and emulate their noble and benign character. In marked contrast to the opulence and pomposity of the Roman clergy, the life of the ordained preachers, wrongly called perfect heretics by Rome, was sacrificial and austere. Since in the year 1150 they could be seen walking in pairs along the rivers and paths of the Languedoc with a thin belt of leather around their waist on black clothes. They opened stores in the cities and towns, often as weavers. They were not mendicant monks. They were known for their hard and honest work. They didn't ask anything, no alms, no maintenance, nothing. The only thing they sought was listeners. The only ritual practiced by them was the consolamentum granted to those who were dying. Those who were so ordained could also baptize and ordain others to ministry. In one generation, these humble and sacrificial preachers could convert hundreds of thousands. Though they were greatly represented throughout Europe, they were most strongly concentrated in the Languedoc. Rainier, a former ordained minister of the Friends of God, stated that there were about 2,550 preachers, wrongly called perfects, in Lombardy and Tuscany alone. After the greatest massacres, there remained about 200 preachers. Believers, however, would exceed overwhelmingly the leaders whom the Church would later call perfect heretics. The honest practice of faith, which disdains profit and exploitation of worshippers, greatly contrasted the pomp of the popes and the corruption of the clergy, which lived in luxury and waste. In order to counteract the power of the Albigensian preaching, Pope Innocent III ordered Francis of Assisi and Domingo of Guzman to mimic the poverty the Cathars preached through their mendicant orders. But they were not able to convert the Cathars. Therefore, this Pope and his successors commissioned these two orders to exterminate the defamed Cathars. And they did it through the awful course of the Inquisition. For nearly 700 years, Dominicans and Franciscans would employ the most cruel and barbarous methods of torture known to history in order to extirpate heresy. The Albigensian revolt was concentrated in Toulouse. The people of Toulouse rejected the decree of the Pope which made Simon of Montfort Lord of Toulouse and of the Languedoc. Despite the impressive number of preachers burned at the stake and the decimated forces of the princes who defended them, the faith of the Friends of God increased. As they saw the cruelty coming from the papacy, more and more people were convinced that God could not be in Rome, that the Roman Catholic Church could not represent the deity, nor could the Pope be the vicar of Christ. The good believers insisted with biblical confirmation that evil reigns in this world and will continue reigning until the coming of Christ. They considered themselves good believers, good men, friends of Jesus, etc. Their message was easy to accept in the context of such appalling ecclesiastic pride and violence. The son of Raymond of Toulouse returned to England to avoid being disinherited by the Pope and gathered all the principalities of the Languedoc. A new crusade, as those which came every year from the north, was called by the Pope in 1216. The principal goal was now Toulouse. The dwellers of that city knew that this would be a struggle to the death. But the nobles were betrayed by Bishop Full, who persuaded them with promises and warranties to negotiate with the new count on a prairie outside the city. That very night, Simon of Montfort and Fulk harvested a large number of prisoners, violating without scruple the letter of safe conduct granted. Habituated to live in a country of honesty where one's word was kept, the princes of the Languedoc fell more than once under the deceitful and treacherous intrigues of the papacy, which amazes even historians today. Several times Simon of Montfort besieged Toulouse without success. Finally, his siege was reinforced by a crusade which came from the north. Simon required the crusaders to do as in Béziers, not to leave man or woman to flee alive from that populous city. But 9 months of siege could not break the will of the inhabitants of Toulouse. The 40 days enlistment with indulgences promised by the Pope to the Crusaders who had arrived later were expiring, and the Crusaders made plans to return without taking the city. Infuriated, Simon of Montfort attempted a last and decisive attack. But he risked too much. He and his brother were killed by one of the large stones thrown by the catapults of the city. His last prayer before the attack was, "Jesus Christ the righteous, give me now death or victory." And Jesus Christ answered that prayer. He gave him the death he deserved. The stone thrown from the city smashed his head to pieces. The great friend of Domingo of Guzman, the father of the Dominicans, made powerful by Pope Innocent III before dying in 1216, had now found his grave. The crusade was dismantled 1 month later in complete failure. It was July 1218. Santo Domingo de Guzman died in 1221. Far from hating the friends of God as causing so much disgrace, the people, even Catholics, began to see the bishops of Rome as their true enemies. A new crusade, called now by Pope Honorius III in 1219, was led by Louis, son of Philip August, king of France, and Amaury of Montfort, son of Simon of Montfort. 20 bishops, 30 counts, 600 knights, and 10,000 soldiers arrived, intent upon seizing Toulouse. Their first work was to massacre a small and inoffensive town of 7,000 inhabitants called Marmande. But they could not intimidate the people of Toulouse, and the expiration of 40 days of forgiveness of sins found them again having failed to obtain the principal city of that region. At last, united, the Cathars princes heroically resisted the papal crusades for about 10 years. All principes were recovering their territories and fortresses, and tolerance and freedom returned to the Languedoc. Amaury of Montfort, son of Simon, acknowledged his defeat in February of 1224 and capitulated on behalf of the King of France, who since that time had become the owner of all that region. Harangued by the Cardinal of Rome, The Kingdom of France organized a great crusade in 1226, the greatest since the first one launched to crush the friends of God. Avignon was not considered a heretic city by Rome. It was there that the famous papal captivity of Avignon took place 1 century after the Crusades against the Albigenses. For 70 years, the papacy moved its see from Rome to that city in the midst of controversies with other popes who disputed the crown of the so-called Holy See. The city had promised the Crusaders free passage toward the south, including their access to the bridge. But when the city saw the kind of people involved in the crusade, they became afraid. In an unexpected movement, the city decided to close its doors. The Crusaders were infuriated and sieged Avignon for 3 months until the city capitulated. The fall of Avignon plunged the inhabitants of the Languedoc into despair. Cardinal Romano of Paris, Bishop Fulk, and Peter Amiel, successor of Arnold Amaury, Archbishop of Carmona, took advantage of that moment of apparent success to send preachers from town to town to warn the peaceful populations of what had happened to Béziers with the destruction of its population of 20,000 and Marmande with a similar fate of all of her 7,000 inhabitants. Only one response to this intimidation would be accepted: unconditional surrender. Raymond VII of Toulouse and Count Roger Bernard of Foix were, however, not intimidated. They organized guerrilla attacks which were decimating the forces of the Crusaders, already greatly weakened at Avignon. At that moment, Louis VIII, King of France, died in November of dysentery, which he contracted during the siege of Avignon. His son was left to the care and governance of his mother, Blanca of Castilla, and of Cardinal Romano. All would see that Blanca of Castilla and Cardinal Romano would share more than prayers. They would offer each other a double service which would unite them as lovers and defenders of the church and state interest. The magnates of France and Rome grasped that it would be impossible to force the submission of the Counts of Foix and Toulouse. Therefore, they decided to try a new tactic. Europe would see how, in order to crush the legitimate inhabitants of the land, the conventional norms of war would be broken again by acts of vandalism. Instead of attacking them directly, they would destroy their crops and harvests. Water wells would be poisoned. Small towns and populations were finally burned and leveled, weakening all that vast region. When the Albigensian counts came to protect the vandalized locations, the French Catholic troops fled to another location. The message was clear: they must surrender and accept the yoke of Rome or die of hunger and thirst. The bishops stimulated and applauded the vandalism of the Crusaders. They went everywhere warning the populations of what happened to former towns who didn't surrender. For only 10 years could the princes of Languedoc recover and keep their noble independence, granting their lands the freedom they desired. Though invincible in battle, Raymond VII finally had to surrender. With all his harvests destroyed, his olive trees and vineyards uprooted and burned, he could not survive even in his walled cities. In 1229, he capitulated and was taken to Paris, where he was whipped and imprisoned for a time. The lashes on his naked back were followed by a Te Deum, which sounded in the Notre Dame Cathedral to seal the joy of the triumph. Only his relationship with Blanca of Castilla saved him from being burned at the stake. From then on, over the course of an entire century, by torture and execution, the courts of Inquisition succeeded in eliminating what remained of the friends of God. The work of the Inquisition, tested for the first time in the land of Clovis, would emigrate to all Europe and Latin America for 600 years, honoring with its horrifying methods the Holy Father who conceived it. The prophet had anticipated this long ago. Daniel wrote, "He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the holy people," Daniel 8:24. The only thing the friends of God could do was to dream of the promises of the Lord, who, speaking of the future glory, said, "Blessed are the meek, because they will inherit the earth." Matthew 5, verse 5. We can consider now the bloody transformation of the Languedoc. The fires of the stake were lit again for many years, erasing any vestige of faith which dared to oppose the papacy. Pope Gregory IX made the Inquisition an institution dependent exclusively on the papacy to avoid mercy in the lower Catholic episcopate. It was this pope who in 1233 repeated in his bull Vox in Rama the slanders against them which were called Cathars, that is, engagers in sexual orgies with felines. The inhabitants of southern France would watch in dismay how, by order of the popes, the corpses of the heretics would be unearthed, to be burned, as the priest yelled, "The one who does the same will suffer the same fate." Raymond VI, who died at the age of 66 in 1222 and had been excommunicated 3 times, was not permitted a public Christian burial. In 1280, Pope Nicholas III issued a bull requiring those who had given a Christian burial to people excommunicated by the Church to unearth the corpses with their own hands and bury them again, dishonoring the memory of heretics. Before that, in 1252, in the bull Ad Extirpanda, Pope Innocent IV decreed that the civil power must be subjected to the Holy Office, a term given to the courts of the Inquisition. In other words, no civil authority, not even the king, could oppose the inquisitor lords in their macabre work of death. Gregory IX, together with Cardinal Romano, decided that part of the heretic's belongings would be given to anyone who betrayed a heretic. That booty would be paid by the treasury of the already exceeded taxes of Raymond VII. In this way, the confiscated property was divided between the informant, the church, and the crown. Decency, purity, and nobility would desert the Languedoc to welcome lies, treason, and cruelty. In 1233, a simple worker called Jean Textor cried out in the streets of Toulouse while being interrogated by the Inquisition, "Lords, hear me. I am not a heretic, because I eat meat, lie, and swear." The people stopped, laughed loudly, and clapped their hands for the defense of the poor worker. Another incident that took place the next year is considered typical. It shows once more the falsity and cruelty of the presumed Roman vicars of Christ. A wealthy old lady of Toulouse requested on her deathbed to receive the consolamentum of a preacher. One of the servants betrayed her, doubtless expecting to receive part of the booty. He ran to the Dominican monastery and informed William Pelgison, the inquisitor of that order, who was eating a meal. The inquisitor bishop and the other Dominicans, together with the prior, went immediately to see the lady. The relatives of the old lady warned her in a whisper who had come. But the old lady didn't understand. The bishop pretended to be a Cathar and asked her to give testimony of her faith. He exhorted her to keep herself firm in her convictions. The woman gave her testimony, and the bishop hurried to prepare a stake to burn her before she died, so her condemnation could be a lesson to anybody. Then he returned with his monks and proceeded to thank God and Saint Domingo on his day of feast, his birthday in glory, August 5, 1234. After that, they enjoyed the meal that had been interrupted. As in ancient times, rebellion and treachery against the Lord, turning our backs on our God, inciting revolt and oppression, uttering lies our hearts have conceived. So justice is driven back and righteousness stands at a distance. Truth was stumbled in the streets. Honesty cannot enter. Yes, truth is lacking, and he who turns aside from evil makes himself a prey. Now the Lord saw, and it was displeasing in his sight, that there was no justice. The prophet continued saying, "For your hands are stained with blood, your fingers with guilt. Your lips have spoken falsely, and your tongue mutters wicked things." No one calls for justice. No one pleads a case with integrity. They rely on empty arguments. They utter lies. They conceive trouble and give birth to evil. Their deeds are evil deeds, and acts of violence are in their hands. Their feet rush into sin. They are swift to shed innocent blood. They pursue evil schemes. Acts of violence mark their ways. The way of peace they do not know. There is no justice in their paths. They have turned them into crooked roads. No one who walks along them will know peace. Isaiah 59, verses 3 to 8.